Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the Greater Atlanta Regional Center for Expertise on Environmental Sustainable Education and Sustainable Development, the Atlanta Greater RCE. And this is the Higher Education Learning Communities Seminar Series. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Nataki Osborne Jelks, who is an assistant professor in the Environmental and Health Sciences program at Spelman College. As an environmental health scientist and an environmental justice scholar, Dr. Osborne Jelks investigates urban environmental health disparities and the role that place, race, and social factors play in influencing health. Also, cumulative risk assessment and the connection between urban watersheds, pollution, the built environment, and health. Dr. Osborne Jelks co-founded the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, or WAWA, and served on the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Just last week, she was before the U.S. Congress, giving testimony on some of her work and some of the policy changes that need to take place. Her talk is Taking Science to the Streets, Community Science and Participatory Approaches to Improve Environment, Health, and Quality of Life in Urban Areas. Dr. Osborne Jelks.
Thank you for that introduction, Michael. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. And if you can just confirm that you can see it in just a second, that would be great.
You're good. We can see it.
Okay. Right. Okay. So thank you again, for this opportunity to present some of my work and research as a part of this series from the higher education learning community within the RCE Greater Atlanta. What I'd like to begin with is just a little bit of an orientation to community engaged research. I have 3 brief examples from some of the work that I have been engaged in Atlanta's Proctor Creek watershed. And then I'll end in terms of talking about some implications for future research and practice and open it up for questions. And I'm going to try to keep my eye on the time here. So in terms of kind of a community engaged research continuum, I'd like to start with saying that there is a big difference in terms of research that is performed on populations or communities, in populations or communities, or with those populations and communities. And the way that I tend to try to engage with communities is to work collaboratively. I believe that community engagement is very important to the outcomes of our research, developing authentic relationships with communities. And when you develop those authentic relationships, then we move out of the realm of these transactional opportunities to engage with folks, but we're building relationships that in the end can be sustaining and lead to social change outcomes. Sometimes there's this tension between, is the point of research to gain generalizable knowledge? And so I would like to posit that there has to be some balancing of, gaining that information, that generalizable knowledge that most researchers are after, but how can that at the same time influence and impact positive changes that we see on the ground in terms of things like public health practice, as well as environmental management and environmental governance. I think my button is stuck here. Okay, here we go. So this is a comparison of traditional academic research versus community research. And I'm just kind of using community research as a broad term. And there are lots of different types of community engaged research along this continuum. So when we look at things like the goals of the research, in terms of traditional research, again, we're trying to advance knowledge and knowledge that can be generalizable. In terms of community research, the goal often is the betterment of the community itself, and the research is just used as a tool to get there. When we look at the source of the research questions, in traditional research, these are generally, generated by the PI, generated by the researcher based on some sort of theoretical, construct, perhaps. And then in community-based research, or community research, excuse me, we're looking at starting from community-identified problems. In terms of who designs the research, in traditional research, it's the trained researcher who is developing the research design. But in community research, there is this opportunity for the trained researcher to work with the community. And again, if you think back to the brief continuum that I showed on the last slide, there's a difference between, even working in a community. There's a lot of research that might be community-based, meaning that it's geographically situated or located in a community. And there may be perhaps a community needs assessment that is conducted, again, by those researchers. And the researchers might be coming to those communities with some preconceived ideas about the issues that they want to address or the issues that they want to explore. But when we're talking about kind of a sharing of those responsibilities, in that the trained researchers and the community members are involved in that research design process, then the outcome can often be something a lot different than it would be if that trained researcher were just coming in with his or her own ideas about what's important and what needs to be researched. So in terms of kind of the role of the researcher, in traditional research, that the role of that researcher is this objective outside expert. But in community research, everybody is a collaborator and a learner. So we're co-learners, we're co-researchers, we're co-collaborators with the communities that we are working with. The role of the community is often the subject of a study, but again, it's less of kind of making the community kind of the subject of what's going on, but the community in studying itself is a collaborator and a learner as well. In terms of the relationship of researcher to participants, in traditional research, it's often kind of short-term, very task-oriented, perhaps detached, maybe not always, but traditionally that's kind of how it goes, versus something that is built on long-term relationships, something that is multifaceted, and the folks are connected with each other. In terms of the value of that research, when we think about the traditional ways that research is valued, it's valued by the acceptance of peers through a peer-reviewed process that results in publication. That's the currency that we are forced to use in academia because of the constraints that are put on researchers. But in terms of community research, the value of that research is all about what contribution was made to the community, what difference happened as a result of this research. When we look at ownership of the data, the academic researcher, might own that data in traditional research versus that data belonging to the community. Right now, I'm collaborating with colleagues in the Collier Heights Association for Resilience, Revitalization, and Sustainability, and our lead community partner, Gwen Smith-Watson, with CHARS. That organization is, as we're trying to figure out, how this research collaborative, happens, what she has consistently said is, we've got to make sure that there's something that is left in the community. And there needs to be something left in the community that others can't take away. And so when I think about the potential for this community engaged research, community-based participatory research, or even this idea of the community sort of owning and managing the research processes that it's involved in, it's all about what are those contributions, but also what is left that can't be taken away. In terms of the means of dissemination, this sort of relates to the value of that research. So in traditional research, it's about presentations like this one, right? Or publications in journals, presentations at academic conferences. But in community research, Everything is important. All forms. So presentations like this, social media, making presentations at meetings in the community. These are all important. Maybe even developing a policy brief for decision makers. It depends on what the goals are of the research itself and the types of methods that community members want to disseminate the research findings. So let me talk now about community-based participatory research, and this is, kind of in this continuum. Community-based participatory research is an approach, and it's not a method. It's not a method or a set of methods, but it really is a collaborative approach that equitably involves all partners in the research process and recognizes the unique strengths that each brings. So this idea that researchers bring their subject matter expertise, they bring their training in certain methodologies, but when we're working with communities, we understand that there is local community knowledge. There is lived experience that is also very important and should be incorporated into the research process. So CBPR begins with a research topic of importance to the community with this aim of combining knowledge and action for social change to improve community health and to eliminate disparities. In terms of some key strategies for CBPR, and there are lots of strategies that we could talk about. There are a whole host of things that we could talk about with respect to the benefits of CBPR. And so I bring this up because I endeavor to do community-based participatory research. It's sometimes difficult to get all the way there in terms of what this means. But really, ultimately the goal is to go beyond community-based participatory research to get to a point at which the community really owns and manages the research processes for themselves. And they engage in things like there's some, parts of the country where there are community IRBs, for instance. There are some groups that I'm aware of and have done just a little bit of work with in New York City, for instance, that have sort of a parallel process in the community. As researchers, within their academic institutions, have to go through the IRB process when you might be engaging with human subjects. There then is this community review, process that researchers also have to go through so that the community can sort of bless, what the research methodologies are, where the community can evaluate if the community is left vulnerable in any way in terms of this research. And so that's kind of an ultimate goal, but a really great milestone along the way is community-based participatory research. And so this is where I'm sort of positing my research, but I acknowledge that it's sometimes difficult to hit sort of every tenet of what CBPR is, but certainly we try. And so here are some key strategies for CBPR. So active engagement and shared decision-making of community members, academic researchers, and funders. And so this is something that can happen. It does require a lot of times that the community is consulted very early, that relationships are built before it's time to submit an application for funding. And so, sometimes I think, folks get caught behind the eight ball, so to speak, when there are great opportunities that come up and then you sort of start looking for communities, to potentially work with. But I really, want to emphasize that when those relationships happen, even before there is a concrete opportunity to pursue, then the potential to really, get to this point of, shared decision making, as well as integrating community members at every phase of the research process becomes a lot more doable. So other key strategies include integrated sources of knowledge, i.e. formal and informal. So here we're talking about, data that, might be collected, that might be publicly available, for instance. We're talking about expertise, again, coming from trained researchers, as well as this lived experience and local community knowledge that people who live in a community have and know. Also, the process in terms of how data is collected in CBPR projects is really iterative. And the analysis uses multiple methods in many cases, both qualitative and quantitative methods. We also utilize multiple channels for knowledge dissemination, as I mentioned in the last slide. And in terms of the achievement of common goals, we're looking at social change, improved health and well-being, in addition to traditional, the traditional approach of generating in some way. I think every other time I try to move the slide, it sticks, so please forgive. So now I want to talk about community science, and I'm really going to start off by talking about this idea of citizen science. Citizen science is an approach. Both community and citizen science are approaches that are used in air and water quality monitoring, and they're being used a lot more frequently these days to address a wide range of environmental justice issues. So I'm going to talk about participatory mapping in particular here today, which is an approach that really applies kind of these citizen science principles to a mapping process using geographic information systems. And I'll talk about a project that I've been engaged in the Proctor Creek watershed that uses participatory mapping itself. So what's citizen science? So there are lots of definitions. This is one that I want to share in terms of science, scientific research that's conducted in part or in whole by non-professional scientists. You can think of traditional citizen science programs like Cornell University or the Cornell, they have an ornithology program that does a Christmas bird count every year. For the last 2 years, Atlanta has been one of the cities that has participated in the City Nature Challenge, which is an international initiative in which there are about 4 days, usually in the spring, in April usually, when cities are competing against each other to have the greatest number of observations about the natural world, mostly, plants, animals, insects, that we might see in our neighborhoods, in our backyards, in our public parks, wherever we might interact with nature and see an opportunity to catalog the species that are in a particular place. Citizen science is sometimes called public participation in scientific research. And it's often a partnership between the public and professional scientists. And there are a ton of different types of citizen science initiatives in addition to the ones that I just mentioned. If you've heard of things like Frog Watch, for instance, that's one that focuses on amphibians. There's a local group called the Amphibian Foundation who that's very engaged in that work. And I'm going to talk about a citizen and or community science project that is focused on water quality monitoring in just a minute. So community science is the term that I use a lot in my work. And as Michael mentioned in my introduction, I helped to co-found the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, and we're a community-based group that works on the west side of Atlanta to try to grow a cleaner, greener, healthier, and more sustainable Atlanta. And this is the terminology that we use because we, quite honestly just thought that the lexicon sort of fit what we were trying to do in terms of emphasizing local community knowledge and elevating the lived experience of community members. And so we have sort of attached ourselves to this term, community science, which really came from, it was sort of an innovation on citizen science, because in some parts of the country where there have been citizen science activities going on, people, in populations or in areas where there might be, a high population of people who are perhaps immigrants and or who are non-U.S. citizens, they didn't want to exclude those folks from the research process. So this terminology, community science, was born. But it speaks to kind of collaboratively led scientific investigation exploration, and engagement in the entirety of the scientific process. So when you think about CBPR, as I mentioned before, it also talks about engaging community members in every phase of the research process, from design to analysis and dissemination of the results. There is another term that I really like, and I feel like community science, in the context that I do it, is sort of situated in this framework. If I can get, this is so weird. If I can get my slide to move here. Uh-oh. And this is called street science. And so this framework was developed by Jason Coburn, who is he's an environmental planner, but also has a degree in public health and has done a lot of innovative work on environmental justice issues as they relate to planning on the social determinants of health, and kind of looking at ways that communities can be involved in planning for healthier futures. So he's written a whole book about this, and he calls street science, as a framework that joins local insights with professional scientific techniques, with concurrent goals to improve scientific inquiry and environmental health policy and decision making. So even though we don't utilize this terminology, street science, we use community science. My take is that community science is sort of situated in this framework. So next, I want to kind of share a conceptual framework for urban health. I do much of my work in urban areas. And when you look at this conceptual framework, there are two things that I have circled here. One falls under municipal level determinants. So this is everything that happens at the level of a city, and how those things, how policies and practices at the level of a city can have an impact on the health outcomes in those urban populations. So here we're talking about government policies and practice at all levels as implemented in cities. Also, urban living conditions, so things like the physical environment, housing density, the built environment, and pollution is something that I feel is very important. And according to this conceptual framework, according to the authors of this framework, these are two areas that are thought to be most modifiable when we're looking at the work that can be done in urban areas to improve the health of urban populations. And it's thought that if we target changes to municipal level determinants, to these government policies and practices as they are implemented in cities, and if we can make some movements on the physical environment itself, on housing, on the built environment, and pollution, that we will see improved health outcomes for urban populations. So now I want to quickly bring in my three examples. The first, my study area is the Proctor Creek watershed. This is a watershed that I have lived in I shouldn't say have, I recently moved to the neighboring watershed, which is the Utoy Creek watershed. But for much of my 20 plus years here in Atlanta, I lived in the Proctor Creek watershed and became obsessed with everything Proctor Creek, and will continue to work in Proctor Creek because of the great potential that I see, but because, this has been home for me for so many years. So this is a watershed that covers about 32, it's the creek itself is a little over 9 miles long. It starts in downtown Atlanta and flows northwest until it reaches the Chattahoochee River. And Proctor Creek is a major tributary to the Chattahoochee River, and it's the only major tributary to the Chattahoochee that is solely located in the city of Atlanta. So I live in the Utoy Creek watershed now, which is a neighboring watershed, a contiguous watershed. And Utoy Creek is a much bigger watershed, but it also flows into South Fulton County, into East Point. And so I live on the city of Atlanta side, really close to Proctor Creek. So Proctor Creek, as a resource itself, used to be a source of pride for West Atlanta communities, a place where children played, where people fished, a place where people actually used to be baptized. The creek is now not fit for those activities. It's one of the most environmentally impaired creeks in metropolitan Atlanta. It's impacted by numerous pollution sources and doesn't meet state mandated water quality requirements, including that for E. coli bacteria. And that that is so because of the stressors that impacted, including a combined sewer overflow facility. So essentially, when we have heavy rainfall events in the Proctor Creek watershed, there's the potential for there to be raw, untreated sewage that is released into this creek. This is important because the creek itself flows through front yards and backyards, school grounds and public parks, and actually, perhaps less than 2 weeks ago, there was an apartment complex flooded out on Joseph E. Boone Boulevard. Proctor Creek is, right essentially along the side of this apartment complex. And so residents had to have been displaced from their homes because of flooding in Proctor Creek. The creek itself does not meet its designated use for fishing. We have some anecdotal evidence that people still fish in this creek. In fact, just a couple of years ago, EPA, under the Urban Waters Federal Partnership, of which Proctor Creek is a location, this partnership features about 19 different locations across the country. And I will say that in part because of the work and advocacy of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance and some of our partner organizations and community residents in the Proctor Creek watershed, we were able to get EPA to pay attention to Proctor Creek and to the challenges as well as the potential for making positive change happen. And that was part of why Proctor Creek got selected to be a part of this Urban Waters Federal Partnership. But my point in bringing up EPA here is that they conducted some studies which showed that there were some legacy chemicals still in the tissue of fish that are currently in the water, in the creek itself. And so that's important because anecdotally, we know that some people are still fishing from this creek. So it's important to us that we begin to address these issues and challenges and these impairments to the creek, and as well as how these impairments to the creek are sort of reflected in what's happening in the larger community. Also, it's notable to mention that in a 2012 study, it's a little bit old, but still I think important, a part of the Proctor Creek watershed was identified as the number 4 environmental justice hotspots in a list of the top 5 environmental justice hotspots in a 14-county metropolitan Atlanta area. This report was called The Patterns of Pollution, a report on demographics and pollution in metropolitan Atlanta. And there were about 52 environmental justice hotspots found in a 14-county region. And these hotspots were places where you had multiple pollution sources and you had a high level of social vulnerability. So low income and or communities of color, as well as in some places perhaps language isolated communities where you had a high percentage of households with people over the age of 14 who don't speak English as a native language. So it's important that Proctor Creek was identified in this top 5 list of hotspots as well. So what I want to talk about now are kind of these three brief examples, and these 3 brief examples help to address. They don't totally address these questions, but these are entry points. They address 3 kind of essential questions, and these are questions that came from the community. So several years ago, the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance joined forces with Environmental Community Action, otherwise known as Eco Action, and a community-based group in the English Avenue neighborhood called Community Improvement Association. And we held a series of watershed chats with community residents. And we had probably, within this series of watershed chats, a little less than 200 people who came to these chats and really began to talk about issues and challenges and concerns within the Proctor Creek watershed. And so 3 essential questions came out of this. What pollution exists in the Proctor Creek watershed? what potential human health impacts are there from this contamination and pollution, and what actions can be taken or proposed to address these environmental and human health hazards. And at the time that these questions, sort of surfaced from these watershed chats, the community was very deliberate in really talking about the fact that the community has some of these answers, but that they also needed and desired to have some outside experts who would come in and work collaboratively with them to develop or to investigate these questions in a way that would help them to make compelling requests and or demands for social and policy change. What the community had been experiencing, generally speaking, is that people felt unheard. They felt like they were being marginalized. They felt that if they shared concerns with city officials, with decision makers in some cases, and with government agencies like the Georgia Department, the Georgia Environmental Protection Division, or even EPA, in some segments of EPA, they felt like they were not always looked at, as experts of their lived experience. They felt like they were, being told that, you're not scientists, and so maybe your take on what's happening is not quite right. They felt like they were being marginalized and that their voices were being muted to an extent. And so community members said, how can we, collect our own data? How can we develop our own databases that help us to put the data in the face of these decision makers in a way that they cannot easily or as easily dismiss us? So in terms of, challenges, I mean, this is something that comes out of the literature that I think fits what community residents were saying quite a bit, or what they were sort of insinuating, is that one, they feel like they've been marginalized, but also that even when that data does exist, they recognize that we have a long way to go in terms of collecting sufficient data to make those convincing appeals for planning and policy changes by the weight of the evidence. But they were determined, let's start collecting and gathering this evidence, and we'll worry about the rest later. The first step here is, let's not just take our stories. Those stories are important, but what we recognize, or what the community recognized, is that those stories alone were not necessarily enough to get them to the changes that they wanted to see happen in their communities. So the first project that I want to talk about is an ongoing initiative, and this is actually an initiative that was started by the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. It's called the Neighborhood Water Watch Program. What's interesting about this program is that when the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper first developed it, they were working primarily with residents from some of the northern suburbs, of Atlanta. So people, say in Roswell or Sandy Springs, who were concerned about bacteria levels in the Chattahoochee River. And so as they began to work with residents in those areas, these residents actually paid the Riverkeeper initially to process water samples. As that work grew and they expanded beyond some of those northern suburbs and began to do work in the city, West Atlanta Watershed Alliance was a foundational partner in that work. And WAWA has been engaged in this work from its inception, in terms of collecting water samples in the Proctor Creek watershed initially, and now it's expanded to the Utoy Creek watershed as well as the Sandy Creek watershed. And these are kind of three contiguous watersheds on the west side of Atlanta. So the idea behind this Neighborhood Water Watch is that weekly residents from local watersheds and or other volunteers go out and collect water quality samples. We're looking mostly for E. coli bacteria, which might give us a sense that there might be sewer spills. There might be some sewer lines that, some ruptions in the line and that sort of thing. And once that source tracking is done, there have been instances where the data from this neighborhood water watch program have alerted the riverkeeper and alerted the city about problem areas that needed to be addressed and fixed. The riverkeeper has a setup in which they can do, source tracking, go out in the field, we look at the data, and they are able to kind of trace, where the problems are, and in many cases, trace those problems to, a sewer, a sewer overflow or something like that, what we call a sanitary sewer overflow. But what I think is really compelling about the work of this program and the work of residents in the Proctor Creek watershed working with this program and working with Wawa is that we were actually able to identify some areas where the city has now made investments and invested over $88,000 in sewer fixes in the Proctor Creek watershed, because there was an area called the Greensferry CSO in the Proctor Creek watershed that is a CSO, or combined sewer overflow facility, that had been decommissioned, but we were still seeing high hits of E. coli in this area, even though there shouldn't have been. And so the city did not necessarily take the community data as sort of the Bible, but they were able to then invest in their own data monitoring. They invested in putting some closed caption TVs down into the sewer lines, and actually found that there were several, in fact, almost 30 sewer lines that they thought were sort of tied off, had been disconnected and tied off. But what was happening is that people from a multi-dwelling unit, kind of an apartment complex, as folks were flushing their toilets, this waste was going directly into Proctor Creek. Those lines were not sort of tied off per se, and rerouted in another area so that that waste could flow to the wastewater treatment plant. And so it's something that's hasn't really been highlighted a whole bunch. There was at least one story that was done, kind of a feature story that the AJC did, in which they talked, broadly speaking about, fixes in Proctor Creek, the fact that there were still lots of fixes needed, but it did highlight, it didn't attribute it to these community researchers, but it did highlight that based on the data that came from the Neighborhood Water Watch program, that Chattahoochee Riverkeeper began to witness some things that were troubling, and through sharing that information with the city then made its own investments in tracking down what was going on. So I really look at this program as, is this whole idea of street science, this approach that, really helps when you have a combination of forces to address issues of importance to environmental health and planning. And this is just a shot of Jason Corburn's book, Street Science, Community Knowledge, and Environmental Health Justice. It's a great read and has a lot of great case studies if folks are interested. So now I want to talk about a photo voice project, and I'll kind of try to tie these all in at the end. So if I go back just briefly to what I mentioned about, communities saying, let's kind of create our own database. Let's create our own data. Let's show people, and show decision makers and those and municipal officials who can do something about what's happening in our community. Let's show them, our data. We can show them better than we can tell them, because if we tell them, they don't necessarily believe us. And so photo voice is a participatory approach. It's a specific research methodology in which you give cameras to, put cameras in the hands of community members, and they use those cameras to reflect and to record whatever they want to about their community strengths and concerns. So we're looking not just at deficits, but also at community assets and strengths. We do photo voice to promote critical dialogue and knowledge about personal and community issues. And we do that through large and small group discussions of the photographs. But the goal ultimately is to reach policymakers so that those policymakers can use that information to enact change in some way. And so this began to seem to be like a compelling way that Proctor Creek residents could engage in a research process because they wanted to document. They wanted to physically document what they see happening in their community. So through things like photographs, through things like videos, when they were told that, for instance, there was one instance where community members complained about an enormous amount of tires dumped along Proctor Creek, to which they reached out to Atlanta city officials and told them about the dumping. And city officials, came back to a community meeting and basically said, you're wasting our time. We don't know what you're talking about. We don't see these tires that you're talking about, and we kind of feel like you're sending us on a wild goose chase. And so as community members began to document things like those tires and send them to the city, to EPA, and to EPD, what we saw happen almost immediately is that there was an enforcement action taken against the company that dumped not only tires, but lots of construction waste alongside Proctor Creek. And ultimately, the city came out with a news story that said this community monitoring, community investigation has led to, us finding over 5,000 tires. And they sort of congratulated the community. But initially, they didn't believe the community until they were able to provide this evidence through photographs of what was happening in the community. So in terms of the Proctor Creek watershed, Photo Voice really helped to answer what are some of the environmental health issues facing watershed residents, what are the broader social and economic conditions that contribute to health issues, how should we prioritize these issues, and what can we do to address them. We had 10 community watershed researchers engaged in this work. They ranged in age from age 30 to 66, with about 8 to 66 years of residency in the Proctor Creek watershed. So we're talking about 325 years combined of lived experience in this watershed. And they lived in about 5 of the 6 kind of major neighborhood planning units that make up the Proctor Creek watershed. They were engaged in this process from start to finish. So from collecting the data, there were over 1,500 photos that were collected. And they were also engaged in analyzing this data and coming up with the primary themes that emerged from the data. So these themes represented threats to the natural environment, built environment stressors that influence health, what they called neglect and divestment of public resources, but also there was this glimmer of hope for the future for what can happen to make Proctor Creek playable, swimmable, and fishable again. And so this analysis really sort of posited Proctor Creek as both this polluted eyesore, nuisance, and toxic liability for residents, as well as a community asset and a natural resource to be valued, protected, and restored. This is a brief conceptual model that emerged from these themes and from the data. So they were looking at things like the lack of engagement of residents in community decision making, divestments of neighborhood infrastructure, housing, and natural resources for the management, for environmental management, as well as, for investments in infrastructure that impact health and quality of life. They looked at things like lax code enforcement, illegal dumping, and they looked at how all of these things ultimately result in negative health outcomes and poor quality of life for the community. And so the power of pictures was, I think, realized, or really is summed up in this quote, that pictures, by creating a clear record of what exists at a particular point in time, can be used to hold policymakers and others accountable. So here are just a few photographs that came from some of the work that these residents did with this project. In terms of the threats of to the natural environment, they really talk from this place of having a strong connection to sense of place. They placed a lot of value on Proctor Creek for many of the reasons that I've already mentioned. They had concerns about sewage pollution, about bacteria, chemicals, illegal dumping, tires, trash, and construction debris. Both things that might be dumped by residents, but also by business owners and by people who live outside of the community. as I'm trying to get my key to move, I'll just say, if you can see that the pile of rubble that is on the left-hand side of the screen, one of the community researchers actually found a truck that came into the community and dumped that waste. She was able to scribble down sort of the name of the company that the truck belonged to, called the owner of the company. The owner promised that someone would come back to pick that waste up. And it never happened. And it should not have happened that, someone would come from outside of the community just to dump in this neighborhood, in the watershed, but it happens all of the time. They also looked at built environment stressors that influence health. And so a lot of this was connected to things like flooding, the flooding associated with living beside Proctor Creek and the mold and mildew that people experience in their homes. There was a study that was funded by the Hercules Exposome Research Center at Emory, in which some community residents were actually able to work with an Emory researcher who is, I think, perhaps now at the CDC, but she was at Emory at that time. And so they did a survey, of homes in the Proctor Creek watershed and looked at, things like mold and mildew in homes, and looked at, asthma rates and that sort of thing. So this is one of the themes that came out of that research as well. I don't know if Blue Jeans doesn't like my keys here. I'm going to try to speed this up so that we can get to some time for some questions. The third theme was neglect and divestment of natural resources. And so, public resources, excuse me. So with this, we're tied lots of concerns about gentrification and displacement of sort of in-place residents, the indigenous residents or kind of long-standing residents of the Proctor Creek watershed. Lots of concerns about, widespread blight, lack of infrastructure investments, inadequate code enforcement, and ineffective watershed management strategies to address things like flooding. But again, all was not lost. Everything wasn't negative. So the community also looked at sort of the assets that it had and thought that those assets gave them sort of a glimmer of hope for the future. This hope, again, that Proctor Creek, through collective work and action between Proctor Creek residents and other stakeholders, can ultimately yield a playable, fishable, swimmable Proctor Creek again. They also really talked about the life, the value, the vibrancy, and the beauty in Proctor Creek, despite the fact that it's impacted and impaired in several, segments of the stream itself. And they see the creek as this resilient natural asset for the community, a place that still does provide some wildlife habitat and something that can be left as a legacy for future generations. And they also had this belief that citizen action and government investments can help to restore Proctor Creek to its former glory. So let me quickly move through this last project and then just kind of tie them all together. So in connection, sort of as a next step, of the Photo Voice project. So the Photo Voice project sort of put, some broad issues on the table. The next kind of step in the research process that involved this same group of 10 researchers was the co-development and the prioritization of meaningful street-level neighborhood environmental health indicators that impact environmental quality and quality of life in the watershed. So, Photo Voice is a qualitative approach. So the community said we want to begin to get a little bit more quantitative, even if it just means just trying to identify specifically where we see problems that need to be addressed and using that as a starting point to press for action. So we use an approach called participatory mapping. So it can be done in different ways. We use technology with it, but some participatory mapping happens with people sketching, maps of communities and highlighting things of interest or of concern. In this case, the community wanted to identify problem areas. And so we used this approach, and we collected data on point locations, i.e. GPS coordinates, for different environmental hazards and stressors in the community. We took photographs, or they took photographs. In some cases, there was video as well, but these all corresponded to specific locations. And we really saw this as a way for residents to kind of begin to speak in the language of decision makers and to prioritize some needed action in the watershed. So the three things that we started off collecting data on were locations where there's often standing water or where water pools. This was really important because the community talked a lot with watershed officials from the city of Atlanta and others about flooding events, localized flooding events. And the city, said in many instances that we're not aware of any, major flooding events since 2002. And so the community, was sort of scratching its head saying, well, we experienced this a lot, all the time even. So they thought that it was important to identify these places where this flooding happens and where water is often standing. They also wanted to identify places where there is dumping, both in Proctor Creek itself, but also, and its tributaries, but also, on the land, in the watershed itself, the drainage basin that flows into the water. And they wanted to identify locations where there was faulty stormwater infrastructure. Maybe the infrastructure was clogged and or collapsed. Maybe there were sinkholes and or depressions, caused by inadequate drainage. And they felt that these were areas that also contribute to some of the challenges around flooding and also contribute to trash and debris in the community. So we developed an app using Esri, kind of ArcGIS online. So many of you might be familiar with GIS as a mapping program, but there's an ArcGIS sort of mapping platform or application that you can use. So we developed an app and we worked with students at Georgia State in they were taking a community geography class. And so the community residents really outlined or designed sort of what they wanted this app to collect, the type of data they wanted it to collect, the types of questions or queries that you could, conduct. And we worked with the students to actually sort of do the programming. And then we tested it together, tested in the field, and the residents were able to collect data on these three important themes, where the stormwater was pooling, or where water was pooling, where there was flooding. And you can see a few examples of some of the images that residents collected with this app. And here's a kind of a bigger show of those. So you can see standing water in one place, another place where there's stormwater infrastructure problems, a place where there's illegal dumping both on the land and in the water. And what was really exciting about this is that city officials, after the community began to present this information and to share it, there began to be a little bit more interest in the city trying to address some of these issues. This you can't see very well here, but this is something that I was able to pulled years ago from the city's own website. And this was kind of a news release. Community investigation leads to Department of Watershed Management action. And so this sort of talks about the work that community residents did to document this illegal dumping in the community, in the watershed. And so here, again, it's hard to see, but it talks about crews being able to remove over 20 dump truck loads of tires and other debris in one day. And these tires were delivered to a recycling into beneficial projects. And this was really just at one point in time. Before it was over, the city spent, or they reported that they spent almost $100,000 in terms of removing illegally dumped scrap tires from along the creek. And also there was an enforcement action by the Environmental Protection Division taken against a company that dumped a lot of construction debris in this area as well. And it all came from this community investigation. I will just kind of end by saying that I love to get my students involved in this work as well, joining forces, with community residents. These are scientists in training, and so it's not very different, in terms of teaching students how to do things like the water quality monitoring as it is to engage, community residents, in that work. And one thing that we've done that really brings those two audiences together is the West Side River Rendezvous, which is kind of a one-day multi-sampling site activity where we get teams of students and community members and others, out into local watersheds, collecting water samples, and we try to get sort of a picture of what's happening with places like Proctor Creek at one point in time. I will announce that we are having a drive-through West Side River Rendezvous this year, which is going to be on November the 21st. And for those of you all who are part of the RCE, we'll definitely send out registration information. If folks want to come with their own kind of family groups or pods, there'll be limited interaction, but we think it will be a fun way to continue to build on this repository of data that we've been collecting for a number of years about water quality in Proctor Creek and other local watersheds, as we look at how these community engaged efforts have made a difference. So I'll stop here because I've talked a little bit longer than I planned to, and perhaps through the process of maybe answering a few questions, I can talk a little bit about some of our lessons learned or just answer your questions.
Thank you, Nataki. So we have some questions in the chat, and I wanted to give people who had posed some questions a chance to ask those in person. Margaret Lowe, if you're here, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. When you're using citizen science, how do researchers verify that the data that was identified by amateur community members is correct? Do you not use citizen science if there are stringent data requirements?
So that's a great question. And I actually meant to include a quote from an article that was published about citizen science by a woman named Karen Cooper, who is a citizen science guru. She's got at least one citizen science book as well. And in one of the studies that she helped to conduct, she actually found, in which they looked at a number of studies, they found that citizen science data sort of, aligns well with data collected, by trained researchers. What I didn't mention also is that, especially when we're talking about things like the water quality data, that there's training provided for community residents and members who are a part of that, or a part of that data collection. There is a quality assurance plan that has been approved by agencies like EPA, because we do send this to EPA data repositories, water quality data repositories. And so that, we really focus on training those community members to be to follow the protocols that anybody would follow, that the trained researchers would follow if they were collecting those samples. For water quality, it would be the same case for air quality samples as well. What I will also say is that, as I mentioned in the case with the city of Atlanta, they didn't take the community data as kind of the Bible, but it was compelling enough for them to invest their own dollars in conducting their own research and investigations, and they came up with the same results that the community members, that the data from the community members came up with. So I think that's important. In another project that we're working on to work with residents to develop a protocol actually for identifying illicit discharges in stream segments, what we have done as a part of that process is brought the city of Atlanta into that training process, so that they are aware of how the residents are being trained, so that they can have some input on kind of what they're looking for in terms of data quality. And we believe that over time, this is an approach that's going to make them feel a lot more comfortable in accepting that data that's coming from from communities. Again, even if they have to do their own research, which makes sense, right? We always verify, results, but we feel like through this relationship building that we're going through, that it's giving them a better sense of how these community researchers are being trained, and it's going to lead to some greater acceptance, of the data coming from community researchers.
And Lauren Hong, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation today. The question that I had was, what are some methods that you use to ensure active engagement from community members so that holistic views of the community are being voiced rather than biased or partial views of a certain part of the community during each phase of research?
So what I'll say is that the research and data collection is always kind of an iterative process. And honestly, it's difficult to always ensure that every single viewpoint is being brought in. But what we do is we're always sort of, opening up the opportunities for engagement to as many people as possible. So, in the various initiatives that I just talked about, there were a set number of researchers that were engaged in this. So, obviously we can't, even the concerns that they brought up, we can't say, fully represent the concerns of everybody in the community. But what we do and kind of recognize is that this community engagement that undergirds this research process is continuous, so it never really stops. So even when we're not working on like a specific project, research project, we are continuing to deepen that community engagement, and we're always looking to have as many people as possible engaged. And so that, ultimately means that we expand the opportunities for people to, be involved sort of front and center in the research. And then depending on the approaches that you use, there are these opportunities to get kind of a wider swath of people engaged, but that depends on the various methodologies.
Michael Hoffman, you want to ask your question next?
Thank you very much first for your great talk. I mean, that was really fantastic. I'm wondering, all this is very positive and these are great projects. I'm wondering about the limitations. So where do you think are the main challenges for this kind of community science or community research?
Great question. So perhaps if I can just pivot back to the last question that was asked, that might be a limitation in terms of, not being able to adequately, address all of the perspectives, of the community. I think there are some limitations, quite frankly, just around still some of the power dynamics engaged, in the research process. It's kind of difficult to navigate a lot of times, as much as we try. And so I'm kind of an interesting sort of case study in that, I've done research, on what's happening in my own community. So I have that community perspective, but, now I am a quote unquote academic researcher as well. And so immediately that poses some challenges in terms of kind of my positionality, the privilege that, I'm kind of bringing to the table. And so I find that I have to check that, constantly, just to make sure that, that we are treating the community as equal partners, in the research. For instance, sometimes the knowledge about maybe funding opportunities to fund research might fall in my lap or other researchers' laps first. And so it's really easy to begin to start thinking about, ways that we could, pursue these, funding opportunities without, going to the community first. So it's just this, you've got to constantly sort of check yourself in terms of, engaging with the community early and often, having them involved from, the front end of the process. So I see that as a limitation as well.
Bruce, do you want to ask the next question?
Sure. Was that you were calling on me, Michael?
Yes.
So, Nataki, thank you for a great presentation. I have I've heard from community researchers who describe lack of trust in the community and difficulty for getting access. That the community is distrustful of the motives of the university. Sometimes has a history of having participated and helped with university research before and not feeling that they got anything out of it. And in some cases, and particularly in the west side of Atlanta, community groups and members who will say that there are so many university researchers who are coming here so often that the demands on our time are extraordinary. How do you overcome these kinds of this kind of resistance and get access so that the community will work with you?
I think that goes back to building relationships, kind of before there is a grant. For instance, before there is a specific project, just building, cultivating relationships is important. A lot of these, partnerships move at the speed of trust. And so there have been some instances, I will, say, even with, the Proctor Creek researchers and with folks in the Proctor Creek Stewardship Council who these researchers come out of, where there were projects that were proposed by researchers at some local institutions. And when we looked at, what those researchers wanted to do, the community said, those were the wrong questions. We're not interested in the answer to those questions. We think that, those questions really relate to, some other communities who are impacting. We think there's something happening in some neighboring communities that sort of impact us, but that's, we don't want to go there. So, thanks, but no thanks. There have also been some instances where the community has said, we've already done this community needs assessment piece. We'd love to work with you, but can you start with looking at the data that we've already collected about our community ourselves? Can you look at, the needs and the desires that we have already identified as that starting place, instead of having us go all the way back to the beginning? And if you're willing to, go, use these tools that we've already developed, then this is something that we can do. But I think to sort of end this response, it's all about just building those relationships and being very intentional and deliberate about those relationships. And trust is something that can be difficult to overcome, especially, in the situation that we see, in which, the West Side in particular is, everybody wants to sort of work on the West Side, so to speak, these days. So, there's a lot that people, are approached with, but, it's all about, those relationships, and, just developing, working with community partners as well. Sometimes I know folks want to engage in the work, and so they might need an introduction, to community. And so sometimes working with trusted community partners that have already been sort of vetted and are working with the communities is a good way to go with that.
Thank you.
Lauren, do you want to ask your other question?
Sure. My other question was, how has the pandemic affected the progress of your projects as well as the collaborative network of community science? What challenges have you encountered, and what are some ways that you have tackled that through this pandemic?
Great question. So the pandemic's actually stopped much of the water quality monitoring data, or water quality monitoring, I should say, for a bit, but we started it back up, I want to say May-ish of this year. And so, there are just, increased protocols around, all the, the social distancing, the masks, gloves, but the gloves and things like that were things that were already required in terms of, when when those community researchers do the sampling and that sort of thing. So it's kind of back up and running now. But we did have a halt in that because of the pandemic. In terms of other things, we've had to adjust to take things online. This is not really a community science initiative per se, but Wawa is engaged with EcoAction in running something called the Atlanta Watershed Learning Network. And this is a training program for community residents to, learn about and to look at environmental challenges in their neighborhoods. And part of the program is that community residents develop their own project that comes out of this. And so some of those projects in the past have been community science oriented. And so while those watershed researchers are just starting their projects, we've taken that whole training series online. Instead of in person the way that it used to be, and so we're kind of adjusting and trying to pivot with things like that, but we're slowly trying to get things rolling again. Just by using the recommended protocols and keeping numbers down in terms of when people are perhaps congregating in the same place to do things.
Thank you, Nunaki. What kinds of things have you felt were the things that you were not expecting in citizen science that you made the most learning out of, that like you didn't go with that intention and then you realized, oh, wait, this is totally different from what I was expecting? What are some of those surprise things from your initial expectations?
That's a good question. That
I know
you
that
may have
that's a
stumped
long
me there.
history back, so it might be hard to remember some of those things with fresh eyes.
I think you got me, Michael. I guess. Well, I won't say that there was anything. I can't think of anything right now that has surprised me. But what has been, I think, very not a pleasant surprise, but just what has been really affirming is that the community wants to do this. And when we're not doing things, they are calling, hey, what's next? What are we going to do? We need to get together. We need to figure out, sort of the next steps, in this process. And so I think that has been something that's been really affirming. What also maybe, again, not surprising, but is encouraging is the way that we have been able to make some small movements with city agencies and officials. For instance, there are a number of green infrastructure investments currently being made in the Proctor Creek watershed. And we're at this point of the city actually engaging these watershed researchers in early on in the design process, of some of these projects, which is something that was not happening before. And I don't know that we thought we would get here. I won't say as quickly because it hasn't been quick per se. And, there's just a couple of projects, compared to the number of projects that are happening. But just to be able to tap into some people who are paying attention to this and who are realizing that there is value in this community knowledge, and that they're trying to, invest in elevating that knowledge to, produce better designs, to create something that the community actually wants and will use, and to just bring the community in the center of the design process and to not leave the community for design charrettes when everything's pretty much been decided and the community can just, put a couple of colored dots on, their favorite alternative. And so the fact that we've been able to kind of reroute some of that has been real encouraging.
Well, thank you, Ntaki, and thank you everybody for coming. We will be doing another of the HLC seminars. Bruce, if you're on, could you put up that flyer? We'll have Pablo La Peña from University of Georgia come and speak on November 20th from 12 to 1:15 on the politics of genetically modified crops and agrochemical exposure in Argentina. So we hope you can join us then. This will be continuing into the spring, and we're working out the dates and speakers for that. But thank you, Nataki. This was wonderful. We really appreciate having you here with us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share.
And if you didn't see it in the chat, Nataki put that published photo voice paper linked in the chat. So you can go right to that.